They're just not getting rid of me until I die, I think. But Carolyn was with us as a student, and the first piece that she did as a student, and she's already a trained artist. I want to say that she came to us as already an artist, but she wanted to have some theological education in order to do some things. She doesn't want to be a pastor. She's actually, I think, been ordained as a deacon in the United Methodist Church, and that's all the ordination she's after, because she's actually interested in doing an arts ministry. So for one of her projects for a class that she took with me, she made this little box. Well, the box actually existed. It's made out of found objects, and it has little drawers in it. And she called it a shrine to St. Lucy. Now, if you know anything about your saints, St. Lucy is the patron saint of people who cannot see. And the reason for that is that Carolyn was blind until she was in her early teens. And this is how she paints. She had corneal transplants and was finally able to see, and she paints these really, really, really close-up things of paintings, watercolors, of flowers that are so bright. I'm sorry that these are so washed out, because they are so bright and so alive that you feel just drawn into the reality of those flowers. They're little flowers, but these paintings are this big. And so you just are drawn into them because she wants us to see the way she sees. And because she was blind, and periodically, her story, which she shares quite freely, so I'm not giving anything away here, she periodically goes blind in one eye, and then she has to have another transplant. And so her eyesight is constantly changing. And to be an artist under those circumstances, when you never know from one day to the next if you will see ever again, is such a testament to persistence and to faith. And what she is now doing, since she graduated from Wesley and spent a year as an artist in residence with us, teaching other people to paint like this, she has started an art center in Knoxville, Tennessee, with the blessing and support of the United Methodist Church, out of the church where her husband is appointed as pastor, I think. It's not real clear to me what all that is, but she's carrying this gift with her as a testament to God's grace in her life. Another artist who was with us in the late 1990s is Jeffrey Lewis. This piece is called Towards Ontario. I wish you could see it. Jeffrey's work has a very different way, where watercolor is a fairly quick medium. You have to really get it while it's wet and work it while it's wet and be very immediate. Jeffrey works in encaustic. Encaustic is a fancy name for wax. Did you ever melt crayons and draw with them, or do that with your kids? That's what encaustic is, basically. It's fancier than that, and the equipment is more expensive, but it's basically melted crayons or melted wax with pigment in it. And it is a slow medium. You have to work quickly at one level because you can only work while the wax is hot, but the way Jeffrey works, at least, is he'll put his brush in the melted wax and daub it on the canvas. And by then it's hard. So he has to dip it in the wax and daub it on the canvas. Dip it in the wax, daub it on the canvas. You can see that building up a surface would take a very, very, very long time to accomplish. And Jeffrey is a very calm man. His whole being exudes calm and patience. When he would work with our students, they would come out of a session with him as though they had been in meditation for an hour. It was more like worship than anything else. The studio, when Jeffrey was there, was a place of such abiding peace. Just to walk in, it would feel like you were in the presence of God. You knew you were in the presence of God. Simply to be in the studio when Jeffrey was there. And one of the interesting things about that is he was going through some very terrible personal things at that time. But he never brought that with him into the studio in a way that was visible to anybody else. He became a witness, again, to his experience of God through the medium of encaustic and through these extraordinary paintings of skyscapes. They're not really literal renditions of any moment of the sky, but they're understandings and impressions of what the sky looks like at certain times of day. So you can see these are called Towards Ontario Matins and Towards Ontario Vespers. So he, at that time, was living in the northern tier of the United States and was looking towards Ontario. So, encaustic as a teacher of patience in Jeffrey Lewis. Quite recently, Karen Swenholt was our artist in residence just this last year, and this is kind of what the studio looked like when she was there. It always looks different, you know. Every artist brings their own stuff and their own way of working. And Karen is a narrative sculptor, and she was working on a series that engaged the 7 deadly sins. Hello. Sorry about that. My computer's talking to me. So she was working on this series, and this is one of those pieces, as it was in the gallery last year in the Artist in Residence exhibition. This is a piece called Mother Mexico, which is a woman who is in mourning. She was talking about the drug traffic in Mexico. So it's a woman in this just state of mourning, and her down here is kind of an opening in her body that, and you can't see it in this tiny little, in this slide, but what's going on there is people engaging in drug trafficking and perhaps her son overdosing. It's not clear because it's not literal, but that's the story around this piece as I understand it. And so it's not unlike the Pieta that you were talking about, in a more modern, more contemporary, today rendition, and engages those same issues of brokenness and mourning and the terribleness of our human condition. Oh, sorry. This is where I wanted to go. This piece, and it's one piece, it's 2 human figures, but it's one piece, is called The Dust Cries Out. It's a memorial to the Twin Towers. And you see it here in an outdoor setting, but right now they are together in our dining room at Wesley. They are 9 feet tall. They're not modest. They are not shy and retiring. Because it's hard for you to read, let me read our curator's words about that. Alexandra Sherman is our curator, and she writes, "Many of us will forever remember where we were and what we were doing when we first learned of the terrible series of attacks perpetrated against the American people, which would become known simply by the date upon which they occurred, 9/11. Yet in spite of the suffering and terrible hurt inflicted upon us as a nation, we all pulled together in the recognition that we were more the same than different. Despite our great wounds, we stood together, as do these figures, stretching their arms into the sky, palms open, not only representing a gesture of beseeching, burning, and thoughtfulness or prayer, but also a reaching out representing hope." Now you can imagine that some of our students will be a bit upset to find these looming over them at lunchtime. When Deidre Krewald, who used to teach Christian education for us is at the seminary right now, teaching in summer school. And when I saw her at lunch on Tuesday, she said, "Things are a little bit different around here since I left." And if any of you know Deidre, I know you know Deidre, you can only imagine. The president did not allow us to put these in the narthex, which is where we really wanted them. But he did say we could have them in the lunchroom. So, along with an explanation. So, they are there, and they will be there through the end of September, and there will be a forum on 9/11 and artistic representations reacting to 9/11 through the month of September. So that we'll be engaging not just these works, but other works as well. And I don't know that I would call those beautiful, by the way, but they're real. They're true in a certain way. So I'm sorry, we're kind of having this conversation on the side, but I think you're getting where we're going with this. Another recent artist in residence was Lauren Rain. Lauren, at least part of her heritage, I could never quite get the full story from her, but at least part of her heritage is Native American, and she engages what we tend to refer to, we non-Native American people tend to refer to as Native American spirituality. She's definitely not Christian, whatever else she is, but she has a very strong sense of the holy in her person and in her work. And this is a piece that she made for us. This is the piece that, it's actually right outside my office door, which I love. And it's quite large. You can sort of tell by the size of the bricks. The bricks are the same size as, bricks. And so all of those hands that you see are life-size. In fact, they're casts of actual hands of people in the community. So she would grab anybody who walked by the studio and say, "Come here, I want to cast your hands." And you'd have to sit there with your hands encased in plaster and for about 15 or 20 minutes, and you'd sit there and chit-chat or talk about deep things, whichever, while your hands you can't move your hands. And then she'd take off the cast, the plaster cast. It's the same stuff you make, if you break your arm, that they used to use. They don't use that anymore. They use something else, but that plaster stuff. And then you would go away, and she would fill those casts with this red clay and fire the clay and put it onto this piece and made this piece. So she writes, she wrote about various people whose hands are in there. One of them is Kendall Solon, who is professor of systematic theology. And she calls him Mr. Solon, not doctor, but never mind, she's not an academic, she doesn't know. Mr. Solon is a banjo player and a beekeeper, which is why I put a flower on the neck of his instruments. The harmonies of music and honey sweeten the mix. Doug Purnell, who was another artist in residence there at the same time and is also a theologian, Doug Purnell is a painter providing the hands of the artist. Olaf, who was a student, makes her art from fabric. She became the seamstress. Amy Gray brought the gardener, graceful hands offering the flowering of an idea. Finally, I included the hands of Colleen Nelson, who has been a community activist all of her life, the advocate. The weavers at work together. And so what Lauren gave us was not just her own work, and this is installing that work and then some details of various elements of it, but what she gave us was not just her working alone in the studio, but in a very real sense, she created community around her work, and she gave our story back to us. She heard our stories as we sat there with our hands encased in plaster. She heard our stories, and she gave them back to us transformed. And because she put our stories together, she gave us a story of the seminary all together as one thing. Now, it's not everybody in the seminary, but it's enough representations of different people that suddenly we have this. And because this piece is in the hallway outside my office, I hear people talking about it. Sometimes I'll pass by. There'll be a little clump of students, older students, telling newer students the story